very much to all of you. Glad to see you here on Sunday morning. We are here to talk about application of the science to our community life together. And Lillian Cannon is co-directing this morning, and she's an entrepreneur with a happy baby company, and maybe wants to say more about herself in a moment. But we thought we would start with these, maybe you want to say.
Thank you, Darsha.
Yes.
That is indeed my name. I am Lillian Cannon. I live in Pittsburgh. I am a mother of 4 children, and I have a business where I work with families to get into the whole natural parenting game with baby wearing and all of the other awesome things we've been talking about. I was really interested and excited that Darsha gave me this opportunity because there is such a hunger out there in the parenting community to know what really works and what we know about how it affects our babies and our families. And there's all this wonderful research being done, and we really want to get it out there to everybody. But as our community member panelists know, it can be really hard in translating what the scientists tell us to behavioral change and helping support parents in making those changes. So I'm really pleased that we could all be here to talk about this. I think the way we discussed doing it, we have heard all of the science all weekend. We want to have, we want to briefly have people introduce themselves, but we want to talk about what we know from the science, and then we want to hear what are the challenges and how the scientists can help us disseminate their research, and what the community members need back from the scientists in order to help people more effectively, and how we can bridge these gaps. So that's our purpose here this morning. We hope there'll be a lot of great talk, and we did have some prep questions which we will go over, but that's pretty much all. I wonder if we might start with introducing our academic panel members. We can just go around. The room is fine. And then what we really want to know is if you had to speak to a group of people that did not have a technical, scientific, academic background, if you had to give a headline, a soundbite, what would be that headline or soundbite from your research to translate, to sort of take it at a different level? And then also, is there a second best? Is there in the absence of this preferred practice, were there other ways that maybe were close or better? Are there second best choices in this? And then also, I don't know if anybody had this prepared, but something, and we talked about the importance of sharing things in Facebook, even though it's Facebook. People love infographics these days, so any sort of infographics that you may have, we would like to have later via email or anything, infographics for public consumption, because these are awesome. People like pictures. It's Facebook. They want a picture, not necessarily. So I'm going to start over here with Katie, because you're in first. So if you could tell us who you are, where you are, what you do, what's your main conclusion.
Okay. I'm Katie Hine. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. And I run the comparative lactation lab, and I look at predominantly how, I look at, so this isn't the soundbite, but just to explain. Right. I'm really interested in mother's milk. And there's a, I think, underrated amount of variation among mothers in aspects of the milk that they synthesize, in the concentration of fat and proteins and sugars, in hormones that exert effects inside the baby, immunofactors, all sorts of things. And so my research program really tries to understand how much variance there is, where that variance is coming from, and then what that variance is doing inside the baby. And I predominantly work with non-human primates right now, but other individuals in my lab work with ground squirrels, some work with humans, some work with hyenas, armadillos, all sorts of stuff. This mammal makes milk, we're interested. And so I guess my take-home message is that it's, I think it's really important for mothers to understand that they're sending signals and babies are adjusting to their mother. And that at the same time, mothers are adjusting to their support network and their community and their culture. And so in terms of trying to maximize optimal parenting, right, it's not just moms in our culture, it's dads too. It doesn't mean that we just have to send a signal to that mom and that dad. I think actually they're getting a lot of our signals very emphatically in really meaningful, important ways. But in some ways that actually is hard on them because the infrastructure that surrounds them doesn't give them maximal flexibility to actually implement best practices. And so I think we have to think of hitting a lot of different levels, that we have to help the most vulnerable individuals in our society. And those aren't just the kids and the babies. Those are also a lot of the parents that are being forced to make these decisions. So that there's an adaptive complex where babies adjust to their mothers and mothers reflect the situation that they're in. And perhaps the best way to maximize outcomes for babies is to help optimize conditions for moms and dads.
Is that your take-home message?
That's my take-home message.
Thank you, Katie. All right.
Well, I'm Jim McKenna.
No, it's okay. So I was thinking, I'm probably going to be gone before this ends. I don't want to be. Hi, me. Pay attention to me before I go. My name is Alicia Leon Driscoll, and my belief is that nature is good. Follow it. And that led us, my husband and family, to follow the child in natural childbirth. We used the Bradley method, and it led us to start a school in the Montessori method, also following the child. So I just trust, children are trustworthy. Follow them.
Thank you, Felicia. That was very succinct.
I'm working on. I'm very close.
Well, Jim McKenna, a biological anthropologist here at Notre Dame. And some of you know I've been sleeping. Let's see if I can start again. I study sleep, and particularly mothers and babies and dads. Very inadvertently, this was not supposed to be my career. I started out as a primatologist and then found tremendous application through personal experience. When my own son was born, my little story is that my wife and I read everything, like all of you, when you're going to become the best parent in the world, and found that very little that we found in the recommendations as to how to care for your baby had anything to do with the babies at all. Mostly had to do with recent cultural ideologies. We were led to one of two conclusions: either everything we had learned in anthropology was completely incorrect, or that indeed the recommendations didn't begin with babies, but recent ways of living. So, make a long story short, I have no simplistic bylines. I could say babies that sleep alone sleep too long, too hard, too soon, and sets them up for sudden death syndrome. I could say that the only power that people that tell you not to sleep with your baby have over you is what you choose to give them. And I think that's very important for parents to know. I think, as I was suggesting yesterday, for a democratic society and for a culture that believes in freedom, that we're very inclined toward authoritarianism, and particularly when it comes to the medicalization of social relationships and decisions that belong in the home. And I think just starting out by trying to empower parents in some ways is really critical, because we've lost that trust of ourselves to make judgments about our babies. The reason I'm sensitive about these simplistic recommendations is I'm fighting always these simplistic recommendations that go the other way and say never sleep with your baby. And they confuse sleeping with your baby with the conditions within which you do so. And when people ask me, should I sleep with my baby, I can't say whether they should or not. I can say separate surface co-sleeping, always, burn sharing. But the answer to the question is it depends. Depends on who it is and what they know and what they feel, whether they're breastfeeding in terms of the bedsham issue. So I get the need for simplicity, but it's been very damaging in the context of understanding infant sleeping relationships and patterns. That's about all for me.
I'm Lee Getler. I am an assistant research professor here at Notre Dame in anthropology. I do research on broadly male reproductive physiology, but I'm especially interested in fathers and how the transition to fatherhood affects men's biology, and also how men interacting with their kids on a minute-to-minute basis also affects their biology. And the original goal, and again, this is certainly not my byline, which will become very clear probably in the next 2 minutes. The original kind of hope of my research, and I didn't get to present all of it this week, was to try to understand how changes from a minute-to-minute perspective, kind of almost a reactivity, might relate to these long-term changes that we've documented over years in terms of hormones like men's testosterone. It turns out, and this is not terribly surprising given say what's been done on the stress hormone cortisol, but there doesn't seem to be a particularly strong relationship between those two kind of longitudinal changes and short-term changes. So I think there's a lot of challenges that are still out there in trying to understand how these biological systems are working in men. But what we do know is we documented that over a 5-year span, if men became newly partnered, new fathers, their testosterone declined pretty dramatically, and we have some indications that another hormone that's important for promoting paternal care across species goes up. It appears to go up when they have a young infant, prolactin. It's higher among fathers, at least in our sample, when they have an infant. So one of the challenges, we've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to speak with Jim at some kind of conferences that had an applied context like this one, and I've talked to folks who are working on the community, like many of you are, about whether this research is beneficial in terms of trying to get dads involved. And one of the challenges is that, unfortunately, we have a very strong sentiment in this country that testosterone is somehow the sole driver of men's masculinity. It's a totally false pretense, but there is this challenge of, I'm sure many of you, if you're working with families that are practicing attachment parenting, if the fathers are really involved with that paradigm, they're probably really receptive to this already. This is not unlike what Joanna was saying. It's the fathers that aren't necessarily inclined to get involved that I think many of you would be looking to target. And are those fathers going to be receptive to you telling them, hey, your body responds to fatherhood, your testosterone is going to drop, it's going to be great. I think there is a challenge there, whether you can stick to a more generic message in the sense of it's not just mothers' bodies responding to parenthood, dads' bodies respond to their babies as well. And you could talk about prolactin. Most people in this society don't really have a great sense for what prolactin is. You could talk to them about another hormone that's increasing in them if they're, particularly we think if they're helping to take care of their children. But there's a lot of variation in these patterns across men, and so there's a lot of work left to do. But I do think, men who see their partners go through pregnancy see the physical, biological changes their wives experience or their partners experience, and then they see perhaps their partner go through birth, and then they see their partner being able to produce milk for their baby. And there's all of these very physical changes to women when they're transitioning to parenthood that men, they don't have those same physical changes, but I do think there's potential to use these data to tell them that your body is responding. I think many of them there's probably some very real psychosomatic, psychological, emotional changes that go along with some of these hormonal changes, and to help them understand that that's not just a psychosocial, it's not just a psychological or emotional phenomenon, that there is actually something potentially going on physiologically or biologically with them. I think that may be able to help some fathers embrace the idea of active fatherhood.
So we're going to need you to not talk about testosterone.
If I can just say, what I take from your research and from, the people that, preceded you, your predecessors or whatever, in the research is that men are no less capable than women are of being good parents and learning, the intuitive things that women, seem to have that men think that they can't have. men can have that, and that's what your research says to me. And maybe by a slightly different mechanism in a slightly different way. When you talk about their bodies, like I mean, I wouldn't even, to most people, like I wouldn't even say that, because then they start feeling like, you know, back in the day when they got the puberty talk. Like, I don't know if you like uncomfortable, like what does my body have anything to do with, you know, what's going on up here that drives my behavior, in terms of the way that most people think. In my mind, people, you know, that I know that have never been really exposed to psychology in depth or evolution.
But I just think it's important to say there's a biology of fatherhood. And people think there's a biology of motherhood. There's no question about that, but there's a biology of fatherhood, sort of like that.
Well, I was thinking, during your talk Friday, I was already thinking, yeah, I can just see, you know, testosterone is about manliness, you know, how do you tell? So it's almost like you'd say, the hormones that make you want to have a lot of sexual partners, that hormone decreases, and the one that helps you want to nurture your baby, and talk about like that, and if they want to talk about how that happens, I mean, there are other phenomena that maybe they could relate to, that like breastfeeding mothers and babies, they tend to wake up at the same time, and how does that happen? It's kind of a mystery. We're not, and how women living in the same household, their menstrual cycles tend to sync up. Again, I don't know if anyone's tried to explain the mechanism. I think it's amazing. So you could give examples like that and not get into it, you know, and then at least prepare them before you start talking about that they're not going to have as much testosterone.
I tend to be optimistic about these things, but I think you can change the discourse around. I think what Lee has provided is something so important, and to convince men or to present to men that it isn't, that something is lost, but that something is gained that's very important for them. And that is a better experience for their children, and men want that as much as women do. And I think his evidence is a powerful foundation that we never had before. One of the first questions I get in my classes when I teach about parenting and infancy is, can the same thing happen to dads? And it's great when I'm asked it. Now we really have evidence that indeed, I already knew that it did, but not without an empirical foundation that Lee has offered. It's really fairly critical, but I think it's one of the greatest moments in the class is when the men suddenly become interested, young guys here, when they know that their biology, you know, is subject to, you know, modification by something that's the most important thing that's going to happen to them, and that is having a child.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that it's the rare counterpoint to this mother-baby dyad that we like over and over again, you know, mother, baby, and even as a new mother, like trying to be the best mother that I can be and allowing my partner to participate in that relationship. Like, you're not hearing, you know, like, oh, the breastfeeding or co-sleeping or whatever, you know, to allow it to be a larger, you know, encompass, right? And that's a wonderful, to even give yourself permission to do that, to allow the father to do what he's obviously biologically capable of doing.
Right. When I was a graduate student when our big longitudinal study on testosterone came out, and that received a lot of media attention, and it's kind of my first experience with the media, and I think I got blindsided a little bit by the sheer interest in the study, but also in the narratives that the media, I mean, there's just, they only want to run with headlines that will get people to read their paper or click on their news link. So it was all about libido and masculinity and fatherhood, emasculating men, basically. And so with this, Jim and I just published a paper about 6 weeks ago, and I worked with a great media person here at Notre Dame. But one of the things I did is, my last quote was about, you know, these hormonal changes in men really suggest to us that men have been embracing fatherhood for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So if that's the case, if that's what these biological, you know, signals are telling us, doesn't that mean that we should think about fatherhood as a bigger component of what it means to be men? Like, that connects to the everyday experiences of most men. I actually am getting more and more interested in this kind of as a result of this media experience, but in terms of trying to understand why the experiences of fatherhood aren't a bigger component of how we think about masculinity in our society, because it's such, I don't feel like the media images of masculinity resonate very well with the everyday experiences of most men, or a lot of men in our society. So I think there's some interesting areas of research that I may move into in the future. But I've tried to now direct the narrative a little bit better than I did in the past, having had that experience. So
I think one of the most important things to me about this is the message that dads are not interchangeable with any other person, that they're not a babysitter. So I think a lot of fathers feel like they're just somebody who's another babysitter. Yeah, and they actually get asked that. My husband gets asked that, oh, are you babysitting the kids while Kelly's at work? I'm the father. I'm not, I'm not interchangeable.
He's parenting the kids while you're at work.
Right. But there is a special role for the father, and that it's not just interchangeable with any other caregiver that provides practical support.
From your research, I'm actually wondering, I have several LGBT friends that are adoptive parents, and I'm wondering if the same hormonal body responses happen in same-sex adoptive, or any adoptive parents, if we can see, check them before they have a child placed with them, and then check later and follow up and see if they're hormones.
I wouldn't be surprised. No one has done that research. I think it's a great question, and something. A project I would really like to do. I think it's amazing. Yeah, if there's anyone in here who wants to do a really tremendous project, that's a great idea. So yeah, thank you for raising that. It wouldn't surprise me. I think that humans do have a really amazing ability, potentially to, if these are neurobiological circuitries that evolve for biological parenthood, I think, given what we see with between individual differences and cultural differences, I think it really suggests that humans can kind of harness those neurobiological circuitries and apply them in very diverse contexts. So I would not be shocked at all if some of these changes have more to do with the investment that the parent places on the child rather than the relatedness between the two individuals genetically.
If that's the case, you might find, say, in a matrilineal society, the mother's brother.
Yeah. I've thought of like avuncular societies. Yeah, I have a whole host of it. This is just amazing. Peter Gray, the kind of again forerunner of this area, he and I did. We're on NPR radio together it was the two of us and two local dads from Las Vegas, and I think that the radio host summed up what Peter and I were talking about in terms of these types of questions as like if there are any blossoming graduate students out there, you should contact Peter or Lee, because clearly there's just a whole slew of research that needs to be done in this area, but these are all great ideas and questions.
Thank you, Lee. Frances?
So I'm Frances Champagne. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. My research group is very interested in the interplay between the experiences that we have during development and our genes, and trying to really build a theory of the biology through which our experiences become encoded within us. And not just within us, but how these effects can persist across generations. And so we look at a number of experiences ranging from toxin exposures during pregnancies to the quality of the mother-infant interactions that occur during the postnatal period. And what's a common theme amongst all of these very, very different exposures is the intense interplay between these exposures and our actual genes. And this is really getting at the nature-nurture interplay, and how this interplay can really set up kind of a trajectory for life. One of the other kind of themes in the work is how kind of larger environmental exposures can shape these mother-infant interactions. So we look a lot at how stress and at how positive environmental experiences, such as kind of an animal model of social support where you have lots of mothers caring for their offspring, can completely shift the trajectory for both the mothers and their offspring and their grand-offspring and their great-grand-offspring. So I think in terms of my take-home message, I think there's a real biology to parent-offspring interactions. It's not some sort of vague psychological interaction. Just like any kind of stressor, just like any kind of toxin, these experiences become encoded in our biology, and they're real. And they can set in motion kind of the inheritance of these traits. And we think about the cycle of abuse and the transmission of attachment styles across generation, and all of these transmissions might involve these kind of same biological pathways. And I think, thinking about those environmental experiences that set this all into motion, the stressors that individuals experience, the whole context of parenting, I think will be incredibly important for understanding why we have kind of a surplus of either pathology or even positive behavior.
Can I just say something quickly?
Of course.
I mentioned this at the beginning of my talk, but I just want to reiterate to everyone here how absolutely lucky we are to have Katie and Francis here. Being someone who's really kind of intimately involved with biological research, biologically oriented research, trying to think about how they're kind of models of intergenerational inheritance, non-genetic inheritance of behavior and these kind of genetic markers and things, how that might apply to what I'm doing, makes my head just spin. But much of, I think, what we may learn about how, the absolute importance of early environments is going to be coming out of their two laboratories, as it already is. So it's really a treat to have the two of them here. So.
I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is that there is this big hunger out there. Like you said, Francis, we had these ideas, but to get real concrete proof where we can go to people and say, this really does make a difference. Then the challenge is getting from methylation to the mom on the street, and that's the real challenge, but also the really great growth potential for this.
Well, I always found that interesting because I'm often asked by the National Academy of Sciences to talk at policy meetings about child rearing and early life stress, and I just think, well, why do you need me to tell you that you should be nice to moms and try and create an environment? You should just know that, and the society value that and invest in that. But it makes a difference from a policy standpoint because this is a model where we can actually look at mechanism and show it experiment. It's not correlation.
Right.
We've induced these things, and it helps make the argument that we need to make.
For me, it also shows, it's not, this dichotomy of nature, nurture, that you, all three of you clearly show that's a falsehood. That it's always together, there's always that interaction. All three of you do that so well.
I have a request for one of your labs to undertake a study with animal models on the impact of birth on motherhood and behaviors in parenting. So if you do a surgical birth, what happens to mothering? If you do a medicated birth, what happens to mothering?
You do a natural birth, what happens?
Yes, exactly. They've done natural births already.
Yeah. Well, there was some interesting work, not by my group, but when I was at McGill, that were looking at C-section. Not from the perspective of the mother, unfortunately, because when you do a C-section, rodents, the mothers don't usually live. But
good to note.
So it's not an ideal approach. Although I would imagine that the release of oxytocin that mothers get through the contractions and the actual pushing of the babies through the canal is going to be very important for stimulating maternal care. But from the perspective of the babies, being pushed out is really important for stimulation of lung development. And I talked a little bit about this in my talk about how the glucocorticoids that you get prenatally are important for lung development. But that push is really actually critical for activating those pathways.
But can you give them pain medication? Can you numb them so they don't have the endorphin response and that sort of experience?
So if you were to give any kind of opiate drug, it would block oxytocin, and that would actually potentially reduce mother-infant interactions.
Yes, that would be so fantastic if we had actual something to point out.
So really, mothers that I've seen that had, I've seen a lot of mothers who had, been in the hospital room when they had what they call a trial of labor, which is weird word to me, but and then they have a C-section, non-complicated, just, you know, kind of elective. And then they're all happy and like, oh, I love my baby, and like, I bet it's the oxytocin. And I thought to it was just, you know, it's a vulnerable time, so I just mostly just, oh yeah. But, you know, so is it potentially the drugs then in that instance, or?
Well, I mean, I think you know, opiate drugs can block the oxytocin system, but we have some very interesting ways of activating it cognitively, through social interactions, through tactile stimulation with the baby. So there's ways that it can come online.
Yeah,
it's just that, you know, if you had a lot of suppression of the oxytocin system, it might delay the turn on.
I've never heard anybody say that it suppresses it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of the biology of the opiate oxytocin system, so it does suppress it.
Interesting.
And I remember there was, in New Scientist years and years ago, there was an article called Numb to Mum, and it was all about the use of opiate drugs. Because it's not only affecting the mother, but of course the baby and their kind of stimulation of the mothers.
Delayed lactation, you know.
Yeah.
The drugs delay the lactation, and had a numb baby and delayed lactation.
And that's associated, the lack of the delayed lactation, that's.
The neurobiology of it is, I think any kind of human work is going to be correlational.
Thank you, Francis. Right?
I'm in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Western Ontario, and we work predominantly with adults who've been severely traumatized during childhood to understand brain patterns underlying social interaction and emotion regulation in those individuals. And we also work a lot clinically with adults that have been severely traumatized. And we sort of specialize on the highest users of our mental health care system. So we really see the most severe population. And as part of our work, we do a lot of early intervention, and we've seen that it can be very successful. Sometimes it takes a long time, but usually our parents are very open to it. I think they know that they're having difficulties, and they're very willing and able to work with us on those difficulties. And I think one of the key things is to support both caregivers. If there's two caregivers, often there's only one caregiver, that is the mom, but to support the mom and or anybody else that is with the mom, and to really focus on the positives and really nurture her along until she feels comfortable. I think it's very interesting what you just say about the relationship between the opioid and the oxytocin system, because a lot of our moms dissociate, so they sort of zone out because being in the present is too painful. And when people do that, there's a lot of opioid release. And so I think that's going to be an important thing to study in the future, the relationship of that.
There's opioid release when they dissociate?
Yeah. Yeah, and actually it's early on in research, but one intervention for dissociation is to block opioids. Yeah. So I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, if you're trying to dissociate, you want to turn down the system that promotes pro-social and interactive behaviors.
Yeah. That's food for thought.
One thing I really loved hearing you yesterday, Ruth, is that there's hope even for these people that have such major problems, and that you can actually look at their brains and see that this does get better, in these difficult situations. And I think that will be important to translate to the public at large, in that you did not permanently ruin your child and thus need to feel awful about this. Like, what can we do now? How can we reactivate this? I think that's a huge piece, so that it can be a positive message.
Absolutely. Yeah, and instilling that hope, I think, is key in any type of treatment. Right? If you don't do that, it's going to be much less effective.
We have some idea that mindfulness helps to ameliorate all of this. Does anybody know how it works? How does it change our bodies?
There are some studies in healthy individuals, and there's some evidence in the depressed population, in the chronically traumatized population. There's nothing published yet, but it seems to bring online some of the areas in the brain that are involved in self-reflection, that are involved in interoceptive awareness and emotion regulation. So it certainly seems to bring online some of those areas. Both the structure and the function, some of those areas seem to get bigger as you do mindfulness training, and function come online more as well.
Are there similarities with bodyfulness, like mindfulness? I mean, a lot of studies have been coming out about the value, benefits of exercise.
Yeah.
Are there equivalents with
There's some
that come
overlap.
from mindfulness?
Yeah,
from
there's some overlap with exercise.
with engagement of the body intensely during the day?
Yeah, there's definitely some overlap. And I think that's going to be another focus of future research, is to compare the two. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of studies going on, you know, with exercise, you know, related to psychiatric difficulties. And I think exercise is very helpful. I think if you do exercise alone and not process any of your difficulties, I don't know how effective that is. So I think those are all questions for the future.
Jean?
Gene Halton, sociology here at Notre Dame. And I have studied consumption in various ways over the years. My first book is on the meaning of things, study of things in people's homes. And I try to argue there that things can act as role models, that we can see ourselves through objects, both positively and negatively. Of course, that's the downside of materialism. When the object comes to place, the object as standing for a social relationship comes to displace a social relationship. And so in our consumption society, which has really ramped up in the last 25, 30 years, you know, we've gone from an environment of more than double the amount of advertising we're exposed to every day. Now it's about, I don't know, 3,000 to 5,000 ads from all sources every day. Advertising for children in 1983 was $100 million. 25 years later, it was $170 billion. This is an intense propaganda effort to control our minds through pleasure conditions. And I think that's significant, not only for kids, but for parents as well. And so it seems to me one useful thing might be to consider alternative consumption as part of parenting practices. Your list I was thinking of, could you come up with the alternative shopping list?
I've done that. I
Have you?
have taught classes about that. By the way, I can substantiate that. I used to work at Babies R Us for
I
about a
actually
year.
did that. I taught classes in New York City about how to house a baby in 500 square feet or less.
Mhm.
It's a way of minimalizing your consumption. And what do you really need besides a bed?
And are there ways to build in something like empathy as a consumption commodity, or you know,
I'm gonna add
or that's on the list?
That's
I was thinking like the organic food movement. If you could relabel breast milk as organic food.
Eat local. No, I've seen breastfeeding t-shirt, onesies and maternity shirts that say "Eat local."
Eat local.
The ultimate paleo diet. True paleo diet.
And then, of course, there's the major religious rite of materialism, which is Christmas. Christmas is the prime means to socialize from birth children into the religion of materialism. And the amount of money that's spent each year, I mean, this is a major rite of passage. And I'm thinking, you know, from the parent end, it's parents have a lot of pressure to produce enough goods for the kids to show that they love them, you know, and
Potlatch.
yeah, kind of a potlatch, parenting
We're going
potlatch.
broke.
Yeah, and so I mean that to me is another kind of area where there could be some focus on disengagement from that matrix to promote more social relation. I mean, because again, happiness is a social relation. Pleasure is a sensation. And pleasure can be a means to happiness, but we have a culture that's promoting the sensation of pleasure as though it could provide happiness. And the more you buy into that, the more unhappiness you produce. High rates of consumption produce negative, depression, anxiety, and other kinds of indicators. So that to me would be one, to think about the ways in which our consumption culture is affecting this whole process. How to get into your song, how do we get into the mind of the baby as we can imagine it in ways that promote parenting? And maybe there are even relations to consumption culture with that. Another point I was thinking of is how can we engage the moving, musical, touching, communicative body in these processes to really put back the capacity for the spontaneous gesture that we're born with back into our social life in general, our educational system in particular, to put the moving body as, if you want to get kids to score well on tests, get them to move a lot, And I'm not saying you want to get them to score high on tests as a goal, but I'm saying, these people that want that, they don't realize if they just put these other recess things, they can get even that limited dwarf goal of high scores, And so our culture again, and particularly our consumer culture, is promoting, it's an antibody culture. It doesn't want us to be engaged in the body, and of course, all of these studies to me are shouting that the engagement in the body with the infant or child is the key to the process, the empathic bodily engagement.
I mean, but you're saying it's anti-body in the sense of thinking it's important like for babies, but it's very about the body, in many other ways, like you're talking about pleasure and sensation. It's all about what you eat, it's pleasure, so.
I actually came up with a term when you were speaking, the oxytoxic consumption environment, promoting pleasure.
I'm an academic, but all I have to show for it is a bunch of questions.
It's pretty clear that we're a pretty subversive group sitting around here, challenging so many of the basic assumptions of our society. And I'm one in that category too. I'm Peter Gray, but not the same Peter Gray that Lee met ago. Although I get a lot of his emails, and I'm often given credit for his work. I'm a research professor at Boston College, and the take-home message from my work is this, that children are explicitly designed by natural selection or by Mother Nature or by God, whichever you prefer, I don't care which, to direct and take charge of their own education. They're built for it. Their instincts to play, to explore, to attend to the adult world around them, to want to participate in that world, to want to grow up, to want to acquire the characteristics necessary to ask questions. All those instincts that are the fundamental characteristics of childhood came about in the course of evolution to serve the function of education. And yet we have developed schools that deliberately suppress all of those instincts. And it's not an accident, because our schools evolved historically to prevent children from natural learning and to teach them to obey. Hunter-gatherers are not concerned about teaching their children to obey, but once we developed hierarchical societies, the goal became obedience. And that's why schools came about. We think they're for education, they are for obedience. So my message to parents is, if you could find a way to not send your child to a typical school, but to rather find a way to allow your child to educate himself or herself in an environment that provides the supports that that child needs, which include ample opportunity to play, exposure to the values and tools of the society and opportunities to play with them, exposure to a variety of adults who represent a variety of the skills and capabilities of our culture. If you can do that, your child will educate himself, will be happy, will grow up as a willful, self-controlled person, and not as a person who's oriented simply to pleasing others and who is, becomes one of the statistics of people who are incapacitated by fear, by anxiety, by depression, and so on. These things which I documented in my talk have continued to grow in our culture as we have increasingly prevented children from playing and exploring and doing what they naturally want to do.
I just recently learned, I thought this was interesting, that compulsory education in this country was not initiated by people who say every child has a right to an education, we need to make it a law and every child is educated. It was started by the unions who did not want the children to be competing with them for jobs. So it was not an altruistic thing to have universal education. It was a purely economic thing. So again, that would explain just, again, it's not, you're not doing it for the children, so you're putting them in the classroom and you're educating them, but again, is it the way that's best for the children?
Barry?
Oh, I had a question. The model with the Sudbury School?
Yeah.
In what state is it, and what is the population?
The number, well,
and the demographics.
the original Sudbury Valley School is in Framingham, Massachusetts, and that's where I've done my studies. It's still the largest of the Sudbury schools, but there are now about 40 such schools throughout the world. They vary in numbers of students from anywhere from just a handful up to Sudbury Valley has about 150 students at the present time. And they come from a wide variety of backgrounds. But because these are not publicly supported schools, there is a tuition. The schools are far less expensive. It turns out it's a lot cheaper to educate children if you allow them to educate themselves and you simply provide the support than if you have to pay people to suppress their natural instincts, to discipline them, control them, and then try to teach them, and then you test them along the way and do all of this stuff. I mean, it's expensive to run a prison and it's expensive to run a school. But if you allow children to educate themselves naturally, they're learning from one another, they're learning, all you have to do is provide the conditions. And this is not expensive education. People make the mistake of thinking it's expensive education, or it's elite education, or this is the cream of the crop who go there because they're so successful. None of that is true.
Well, it's not expensive societally in the larger sense, considering how much is spent per child at various other educational opportunities. But for the family, for the individual families, it is expensive.
Right,
I
but
mean,
that's a problem that we can solve at a societal level and save money doing it if we choose to do so.
Or could we take some of what's been learned from that kind of school education and incorporate it into other educational opportunities for children to broaden the base instead of just the ones that have access to it, having access to it. I mean, my husband's earning a master's in education right now. And I'd love to say, here, honey, why don't you take this to your professors and see if maybe you can spread these ideas to your classmates and see if we can maybe find things that are usable in that, even in the public school environment, and change society a little bit in lots of different ways to get it towards the goal of having an education like that available to every child.
Barry.
My name is Barry Hewlett. I've been fortunate enough the last 40 years or so to be actually, to live with one of, actually many different hunter-gatherer groups, primarily in Africa. Just a few comments that too, in terms of cautionary comments and really going to, and what Joanna said a little bit earlier about the diversity of different groups and in terms of messages and stuff. I mean, that as an anthropologist, I mean, that the first thing, I mean, for me is that, I mean, in terms of we need ethnographic research on where parents in different groups, where they're at, what they know, what they don't know, and that if we're going to do anything about these messages, we have to understand our, like you said, the target audience, but we have to conduct research. And we need that basic research on these families, and that we need to build upon what they know. So many of you talked about the positive, you know, but we need to build upon what they already know rather than coming in, I think, you know, I see this over and over again, this top-down, and that's how I kind of feel here, is it's sort of like top-down again. And you know, one of the things about, you know, when we talk about autonomy and stuff is that when we make decisions like that, it's another example of taking autonomy away from parents. And even though we have our strong feelings about what's right.
What's another way of taking it on?
When we make decisions for parents, when we're coming down and saying this is the best way to do it, okay, that's another, I mean, it's just, whenever you're telling your, you know, this is the best way, I mean, all these sort of work, you know, you take autonomy away when you do this. But anyway, so that, one is that the research, you know, the ethnographic research before you try to get these messages out. The other thing is what Jim McKenna, I mean, he's a model for me in terms of emphasizing the adaptive design. I mean, that all of his research focuses on, in terms of co-sleeping, on the adaptive design of that, in terms of the fitness, benefits for infant and mom. And over again, that is a real strength, and he emphasizes that. And I think that in terms of the things that I've said about, you know, co-sleeping, autonomy, egalitarianism, I mean, that everything in terms of hunter-gatherer way of life, that part of the adaptive design is to enhance sharing. I mean, that is the adaptive design. Everything that I've sort of talked about, I mean, in terms of all those different dimensions of that hunter-gatherer way of life, it's to enhance sharing with other nuclear families. And so that because on a hunting-gathering way of life, you have variability in terms of what comes in every day, and to enhance your survival, you share so that that variability is decreased. And so that everything in terms of what, you know, that I was trying to say, that it has adaptive design. And so it's hard for me to see certain things ripped out in terms of you take little pieces that you like, and that it's you know, it's taken out of context. And so I mean that many of the things that are talked about here I value myself, but anyway, just that there's an adaptive design to those particular patterns. In terms of just sort of headline news kinds of comments, I mean that one would be quantity time matters. I mean that quantity time. This is a little bit of an older debate in terms of quantity versus quality time, and that my own research, primarily much of my early research was with dads, but that quantity time matters, and that in terms of, and much of it, what I heard is that in terms of the maltreatment kind of situations, is that quantity time matters because we need to know our kids in many different contexts and need to know them well. In terms of responding to them, understanding them, we need to have them around as much as we can. I mean, and just like the Akka say, keep your kids close, you know. You're doing a great job. That is exactly what I mean. You bring them to different contexts, and you get to know them in different contexts. They get to know you in different contexts. So it benefits both the child, as the child's growing up. They know more intimately what it's like to be a mother or father or parent. And so that they have these intimate role models to see you in many different contexts, and it benefits you to better understand your child. And so that this, yes.
Can I just, so you don't mean child-centered?
No, not child-centered. But I mean,
How
simply
about
that to be around.
Life-centered, that's the term.
Yeah, simply to be around. I mean, it's not that you're focused on the child, but I mean that that you bring your child, or whenever you can. I mean that you're just just like the Akasai, you keep them close. They're not this face-to-face kind of interaction that I see over and over here in terms of recommendations. You should talk to your kids. You should have this face-to-face interaction. I mean that's a Western sort of conception, but the second.
I think that the quantity time over quality time actually encourages less of that child-centered.
Right.
Because when you're focusing on quantity time, you're trying to do everything, or quality time, you're trying to be as, we need to get the best quality interactions we can, and
Right.
your brains might not be in sync. You might not be at the same, somebody might somebody might be in a left brain mode and the other person in a right brain mode. Whereas if you're just around your kid a lot more,
Yeah.
you have that natural, you'll sync together, and then you'll go off and do your own things in close proximity, and then you'll come back and sync together.
Right. Yeah, no, in terms of that's one, I mean, that's my life with the hunter-gatherers, that quantity time, being around, your kids is really important.
What do you suggest to not do the top-down in Western society for us? Like how?
No, I mean, not to do top-down is in terms of talking to parents, talking to families, what's important to them.
Not just go in and tell them what to do.
Not just go in and say quantity matters. You can't just go in with these short little messages. I mean, you have to understand where folks are at. And so, I mean, and once you find out where folks are at.
Tama first.
Well, I was just gonna say that we were having a conversation at lunch where Lalayshi League leaders and raising a child in amongst the things you already do, right? And so we have actually older children that still participate in this very baby-centric thing, and now to have 12 and 15-year-olds that understand babies and like babies and value babies, and it's just because they've been immersed in in this multi-generational experience. It's not like I did that for them, but there's been a positive result on the other side. And I think that's a good example of what he's talking about.
One other,
No, we had two more comments here.
sorry.
Well, I'm Lynn Poinsettia, and I've done the intervention with the heart-to-heart, so I wanted to reflect on, and I'm a developmental therapist for the last 24 years, going to home visit through Logan Center, working with 0 to 3 population, working very closely with the moms and the fathers. One thing I was going to say that's exactly right. I'm listening to all the research, and I'm thinking it's real great, it's fascinating. But how to convey this to the parents? And somebody asked, how do you get the parents not to, how do you buy into it? And what you said is you talk at their level. You get a rapport with them first, and you ask them, what they do, what they're doing. You see what they're doing, you build on that. And, I think I've done play. I mean, a lot of the parents don't know how to play in our society. And they're so focused on the academics. It's like, at 2 or 3 years old, they want their child, they think their drawing is like coloring books or making them do letters. And they're just so, they just have lost the ability to understand spontaneous, what they can do creative, with the, so I do think that that's really important.
I have a bioanthropology coloring book that I read from. Just throwing that out there.
And I like to just give them a paper and let them, do imitation and,
I also just want to comment on the point that Barry made right at the outset of what he was saying, that I think it's so important that we not see ourselves as taking autonomy away from parents, that we not see ourselves as yet another set of experts trying to tell parents what to do, that our goal should be somehow to empower parents rather than to disempower them, not to say you need to do what we're doing or your child will be all screwed up. That's probably not even the case. Children are really remarkably adaptive. But to say, to give them the power to make their own decisions, to not feel that they're doing something terrible if they decide to breastfeed their child or co-sleep with their child or send their child to a Sudbury school or or unschool their children or do what seems natural and better to them. If we believe that these really are the natural and better solutions, people, when they're free to make a choice and they have the information, will choose those things. I think we need to trust parents. We need to not think that parents are idiots, like so many experts do, and become yet another person who, like, yet another force that is sort of disempowering them, making them feel guilty for whatever choice they make.
I mean that in terms of, I don't think that parents are going to buy this hunter-gatherer story. I mean, parents are just, parents today are just like we're all humans that interested in survival. And so that the idea of, well, this is the old, this is the ancestral way,
That's an interesting point, because especially with, with some people, the animosity towards evolution and that whole idea, and sparking that conversation, which is unnecessary when it comes to just everyday stuff.
But I do think, that there are lessons that we can learn from small-scale groups or hunter-gatherer groups. And another potential message, is that trust and empathy enhance rapid learning. We know that from hunter-gatherers and that's part of the hunter-gatherer pattern, is that you develop this, the intense empathy, concern for others, trust of self with others, but all of this contributes to rapid learning. Okay, so that something that Adam's been working on, we've been working on in terms of, that these kids are, if you saw the video, the kids are learning very quick and very early to do a wide range of skills, and so that it's just a potential in terms of the co-sleeping and all the other sort of things in terms of breastfeeding and all the rest. All of these things contribute to enhancing of trust and empathy, and that can enhance actually rapid, because that's important to parents, because parents want our kids to survive in our culture here. It's easy to say, hunter-gatherers.
I've actually had personal success talking to people about this. I don't go as far back. Go back to the Middle Ages. You don't have to go back to hunter-gatherers. Go back to the Renaissance. People are always, when I say that I give birth at home, they're like, oh my God, that's so dangerous. And I said, because women used to die in childbirth in large numbers. I said, actually, if you look at the data, if women survived to childbearing age, they had longer life expectancies than men throughout most of history, which kind of goes against the argument of birth being this horribly dangerous thing. There might be factors that make it more dangerous, like spacing the children too closely together, starting childbearing too young, that make it more dangerous, but that doesn't make birth itself dangerous. It made the societal norms of that period dangerous. And that gets them thinking, and I said, think about other things that societies that didn't have bottles, didn't have cribs, were doing. They were sleeping with their babies, they were breastfeeding their babies, and the length of breastfeeding varies so much by different societies, and even by different classes within a society. With higher class women, the tradition of wet nurses has been around for so long. Royalty were encouraged to hand off their babies to a wet nurse so that they could get their fertility back and produce another heir and a spare within a year. Within a 12-month time span, they're giving birth twice. And it's really hard on their bodies. And those are the ones that we know more of the stories about. We don't know the stories of the peasant women out working the fields, making 10 babies or more over the course of their lifespan, and their children are 2 to 3 years apart through natural family spacing from normal term breastfeeding. And they start thinking about this, and they're like, oh. And I said, yeah, and this still applies. And your baby is still born expecting this environment. Your baby is not a 21st century baby, it's a baby. And it gets them thinking, and it really has progressed conversations a lot with non-academics. These are just parents I know that are pregnant with their first child, and that are like, oh, Ami, you look into this stuff. Why do you do what you do? As an academic, why do you do that? Why do you parent that way? And I said, well, this is what it's based on, and bringing it to a language they can understand.
Right now, I definitely agree that database needs to be data-based.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have the science, to support,
I think you're also making a really interesting meta-argument, Barry, in that if we're talking about attachment parenting babies, and not being directive, and how can we be directive when we're talking to the adults? That we need, like, the meta argument is that we need to be attachment parenting the adults as well. You know, we need to be with them in that way. You can't be directive in order to tell them to not be directive.
One of the things that we do in the late, excuse me, in the Laity League is to, we have very specific sort of training as leaders to not say, this is what you should do. We do not provide advice to our parents. We say, there's a key phrase, a lot of mothers find, for many families, this works. And this is the information, this is what we know. So we do provide information, we provide stories, but not about ourselves. We're very careful not to say, like, for me this worked, and when I had a kid I did this, and this is what happened. Because it is all about empowering that family to make their own decisions so that they own what happens in their own lives, because there's this external locus of control when you're not empowering families, and they blame other people for either the success or failure of what's happening in their lives. But if you instead empower them, then they say, well, I made the decision that I made based on the information that I had, and I did the best that I could. Then they have ownership over what's happening, which is a much healthier state psychologically for them to be in.
And to add to that, you know, we do very active listening, and we take classes in active listening, so that most Laity League leaders, we like to fix problems. We're problem-solving people, and so I want to wean. Well, okay, let me tell you everything I know about weaning. You know, where instead, like, oh really? Why are you interested in weaning? And you know, then she tells you her horrible mother-in-law is trying to make her wean. You know, like it's a much more dynamic conversation of listening and giving the appropriate response instead of I have all this information I must dump into you.
Which is what we're trying to get them to do with their children when they're asking those uncomfortable questions too. So it's kind of modeling that behavior and teaching them.
I just think that the build on what parents and families know is actually really critical. I think that I underlined it like 3 times because I think that this will probably be the thing that I take away the most. I think I actually do a little bit of that already, but it certainly can always get better. Because, I mean, how to take that into a social message, this will be thought, brain power. But when you're dealing with individual people in an individual situation, so you have 10 groups of parents who have a collective knowledge and are there to learn from me or from someone else in some way, but knowing first where they are, I have to know that in order to really sort of teach them anything anyway. And that does, I think, really give them the sense of to make a choice of what's best for them. I think for me, this is probably the most powerful statement. We always say meet them where they are at, which drives me crazy because it's a prepositional at the end of the sentence anyway. But so I like, and I feel like that's a little vague, like, you know, in terms of what does that mean? How do I do that? So building on what they already know is, I think, really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so.
Adam.
Oh, Adam.
Adam, you want to?
Yeah. Sure, thank you.
Empowering you.
No, that's okay. Did you finish?
I'm done.
Okay. Well, my name is Adam Boyette. I'm an ABD graduate student at Washington State University. Had the good fortune of working with Barry in my graduate career. And so I can speak to my experience studying the anthropology of childhood, and I've specifically mostly studied social learning among children in the middle childhood years, between kind of after 4 years old until adolescence. And so more like kind of what Peter's age area versus early in life, but I can at least say a few things I think that are applicable to early life, that is, I mean, teaching parents, so later in the life span, and how they may then become parents, and so how that part and pulling it together. the point being childhood's in the middle. In terms of sort of, we talk about this EEA and this environment of evolutionary adaptation, and we talk about hunter-gatherers, and Barry and I talked about this a little bit, and so I worked in two communities. I worked with Aka hunter-gatherers for my research, and also I did a comparative study, so I spent time with those kids, and then I also spent time with kids in the neighboring farming village. So when these two cultures interact on a daily basis, there's a lot of exchange, but they are really distinct in a lot of ways. And so we really like to take on those important things from the hunter-gatherers. We really reflect on the egalitarianism and the sharing as being really important. I do as well. But I will just, I think, speak from sort of the cross-cultural context of childhood in these sort of small-scale contexts and what we can learn from that. So there are really cool and important things that come out of living as a hunter-gatherer in terms of your social behavior, and the empathy stuff is really important, especially between parents and adults and infants. And that part is not as strong in the way that culture shapes parenting and child development in, for example, the Ngandu farmer context. Parents are somewhat more removed from their kids. But what you find then is that these kids are spending a lot of time with other children. And so they form these attachment relationships to siblings. This has been very well characterized in cross-cultural research in small-scale societies, and it's definitely what I see. And so in both contexts, children are always learning, I guess is one main point. The tagline I would put out there in terms of the adaptation component is that children are adapted to learn. I mean, our bodies are programmed from early on in terms of kind of recognizing our environment from methylation before we're even born. But then, you know, we go through this trajectory influenced by our environment, and I can talk about childhood. In these contexts, children are learning at all times. And so children are adapted to learn. They spend a lot of time in learning sorts of things. And so I think one of the significant things about play in both of these contexts is that it is this activity. It has a number of different sorts of functions, but children spend time doing it because it does help them get good at what they need to do later in life. All of this stuff does not stop, you know, when you develop economically, your infrastructure grows, and you have a society like we have. I mean, we are also, our children are learning at all times. And so the adaptive stuff is still there, but the environment is different. And so a couple of things I think that maybe is we could learn, and this does get back to parenting, is that in this environment, you know, children are always learning. Children are adapted to learn, but children teach children. And one of the things that's very clear in both of the contexts that I've watched is that children want to play with babies. And in the farming context, when parents' work obligations take them away from the home very often, other kids are actually responsible for the babies. And these are even 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, taking care of infants and toddlers. And in our environment, we do not get to know other children as children. So when we become young parents, we don't know what the heck to do with a baby. And so I think that teaching children is important at that level in terms of being exposed to younger children, then growing up in terms of being, you know, then being a parent later, but also in between, because children are learning so much from each other. This interaction is really crucial, and it's easier for kids to learn from other kids who are a little bit older than from adults, I think, to some degree, at least some sorts of skills. And we do not allow structures, we do not have structures in our society that allow that to happen so much. Kids get to play with their siblings, and on the playground, maybe somewhat, but it's still like 5th graders out on the playground, you know. 4th graders, they're all age graded, and you don't really get sort of this sort of thing. And anyway, I found that that's constantly what kids are doing. This is how they spend their time. This is whom they're learning from.
but they're also learning from everyone else. So the last tagline I'm not taking too much of the tagline space there, but human learning is community-based. So we have schools that teach specific things. Kids are learning outside of school because kids are learning at all times. They are watching, they spend a lot of their time observing the environment. This is being internalized. They watch screens in our culture a lot. This is being internalized. You know, you see changes in the way that they do have empathy, you know, and things like this. I mean, if you're learning from other people, you're in physical contact or social proximity to other people, you're learning from them at all times. You know, I mean, throughout our lives, but obviously in childhood, there's a number of cognitive changes that happen that seem to be really targeting towards promoting certain kinds of learning in children. And so human learning is community-based. We are always learning, and so our communities can be structured in ways that promote certain kinds of learning, I think. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. That's what I've learned.
Just a quick point, something you said about children learning to play with babies, that's so true. I remember that from childhood, and I see it every day with my sister's kids. Has anybody heard of roots of empathy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Started in Canada.
Okay.
Is there any schools there?
Is there
Roots of empathy? So what happens is a classroom kind of adopts a baby. The baby comes in once a month for 9 months, and they learn about baby development. And
when I discovered that, I was like,
cool.
So cool, you know, one of those kind of things.
So it's a way to teach empathy?
Yes, and it's so kids, there's lower rates of bullying, right?
Yeah, the research suggests that there. I mean, this is amazing. What a small manipulation. A baby in the classroom once a month. That's it. You're not holding a baby as a hunter-gatherer would, you know, day after. Once a month, a baby there, you're talking as a class to the mother, looking at the baby, thinking about the baby, and bullying, a side effect. They didn't initially even think to test this. This was the main purpose originally, as I understand it, was so that young people would learn about the responsibility of mothering, and they wouldn't become pregnant too quickly. You know, but a side effect was that the teachers began to notice the kids were being nicer to one another, and so there was actually a study done. Now, I haven't yet seen the data, but presumably the results are that bullying is significantly decreased. It's the first reliable anti-bullying program that I know of, if this is true, in schools.
Another thing, this is just an observation I've made recently because I'm kind of at the age where all my friends are having babies, and so I've got to spend a lot of time with a number of infants. And as you know, you walk down the street with an infant in proximity to you, every little kid, like so 5 years old or older, they go baby, and they are drawn to the infant. So this is something that I think is something that we want to do as children. We are interested in being near these younger creatures, and you know, most of the time we don't get to be.
That's what they say at this organization is babies kind of become the teachers in the classroom, and that's, I think, and what he said about little changes. I mean, when you're talking about people's research, you know, the research of this room that has social implications. You know, and things that are particularly controversial or may be considered extreme. Change, you know, doesn't happen like that, you know, large scale. You're talking about little things, little reasonable compromises like that you can make on a community level. You know, I think is the thing to focus on first. You know, when you're just kind of starting on that journey of social change.
I'd like to start just a few things in relation to what was said before, and then we'll go to our community members, which Lillian will guide us with. But in response to, I worked in Minnesota with State Department of Education and teachers across the state on developing moral character interventions in their classrooms in schools. And we wanted it to be integrated into what they already did. Because a lot of times teachers get a program, they do it once, and then they put the book on the shelf. So we wanted them to actually figure out how to just slightly change their regular instruction so they teach an ethical skill for moral character development. And our framework that we use is we came to local community groups. So instead of teachers, parents, community members, and we presented a research framework. So we said, these are the ethical skills that people talk about, that have been researched, that, and like there's a big framework I can tell you about, but I'm not going to do that. And then we said, here's a pedagogy that works, novice to expert instruction. Now, you, with your local needs, identify what you need, what your students need, how it fits in your culture, and you decide how to implement. So we're not telling you, we're just giving you what we know. You know, we're the researchers, so you don't have to think about all that stuff. Here's what we've got. You implement the way you see fit. And so then we guided them figuring out how to do that. Now, since then, I've also developed a set of principles based on research for teachers of what to do if they're just in the classroom for the first time. What do you start with? That caring relationship. You've got to have that secure attachment relationship with the student, or you're not going to get much done, if you think of it in a utilitarian way. But the second, you need a supportive community in the environment, in the classroom, that extends to the local community, the neighborhood. Then you want to focus on skill development. If you want to break it down, you should do this all at once, of course. But for novice teachers, it helps to break it down. So then you have a set of skills, and we had 28 skills, and each with sub-skills on ethics. Novice to expert instruction, how to do that. We have 4 levels of novice to expert learning. And then self-authorship. You want eventually the student not to need the teacher, right? So you have to help the student figure out how to self-regulate, how to self-monitor, and so forth. So we try to be honor the local and the uniqueness of each culture, each person, each student. Because this, again, is honoring the student. They should decide where they're going, as we've been talking about. So my one, I could say a lot of things, but my little short slogan would be, we co-develop one another. Co-construct is what I would usually say, but that sounds like a big word. But we help each other. We're always changing each other and fostering particular personalities or orientations or worldviews by how we treat one another, by what we say and how we act and what we attend to, what we focus on.